Hi, and welcome to the first episode of Family Conversations. My name is Jimmie Manning, and I'm professor and chair of communication studies at the University of Nevada here in beautiful Reno. And my research examines meaning making in families, especially in terms of how families navigate difficulties, differences, and disparities. But beyond my personal research program, I love what family communication does, both in terms of the theory it generates and the applicable elements of family communication research that can be applied to a variety of situations and contexts. And that's why I've invited several scholars to join me for a series of conversations about their work. On Family Conversations, you won't find fancy production values. We're right in the middle of COVID for this first season, and so you won't see me looking especially great either. Everything you get on Family Conversations, in fact, is pretty much going to be raw and unedited. But what will lack in polish, I hope you'll find that we more than make up with in terms of stimulating conversation on a variety of topics, issues, trends, and ideas related to family communication and family communication studies. So if this goes right, the result will be a program where you can learn about new ideas for your teaching, about research that is ongoing in the field, and ideas that you can take back to your own families and use for better family communication, or just to understand what's going on in terms of the family communication. And I think, as you will see in today's episode, we'll also get a good sense of the history of family communication studies and why people do the work that they do. One last note, the prompt for starting this series comes from the 2020 National Communication Association Speaker Series. As part of that series, I'm delivering 5 sessions on diversity and difference in family communication, and you can check that out in the links section. But I just wanted to point out that even though you might hear some references to that, all of the videos in this season of Family Conversations should be able to stand on their own, and you don't need that speaker series in order to move forward. But if you are here because of the speaker series, welcome. Okay, so now that I've told you a little bit about what the program entails, let's get right into the first episode. And as you might have noticed, I'm here with Dr. Don Braithwaite from the University of Nebraska, who fittingly is the first guest on Family Conversations. Mm-hmm. Dr. Braithwaite is Willa Cather Chair and, for at least a few more days, Department Chair for Communication Studies at the University of Nebraska. Her research centers on communication in understudied and changing families, as well as communication rituals and dialectics of relating in step families and among voluntary kin. Dr. Braithwaite has authored over 120 articles and is co-author or co-editor of 5 books, including Family Communication, Cohesion and Change, and the very popular Engaging Theories in Interpersonal Communication. She received the National Communication Association's Brommel Award for Outstanding Contributions in Family Communication and the NCA Becker Distinguished Service Award. And then she's also a past president for both the Western States Communication Association and the National Communication Association. So clearly she has been a monumental influence in our field, and especially in the area of family communication studies. And before the program started today, I said, I don't know if there's anyone, you and besides you and Kathleen Galvin who know this much about family communication. So that's what I wanted to do with this first episode, was to kind of get a sense. And so I'm so delighted to have you as our first guest on Family Conversations. Welcome, Dr. Braithwaite.
Thank you, Jimmie.
All right, so let's jump right into the first question. And this is the question I plan on asking everybody to begin. And that is, how did you find family communication studies? What was it that was appealing to you or that you stumbled into? Or how did you find family communication studies and what got you here?
Well, that's a great question. I was a communication major all the way through college. I have an AA, BA, MA, and PhD in communication. And at some point in my undergraduate years, I found interpersonal communication, which was very new at the time, and studied interpersonal all those years. My dissertation was on the communication of people with disabilities and their non-disabled friends and relatives and others. There were always a little bit of family communication work going on, but most of the time that was in interpersonal communication because there was no separate field of family communication. There was no interest group at the National Association. But most of the time when people studied families, they studied couples and they studied marital couples. In about the mid-'80s, people started branching out and studying family communication on its own. And at that time, my research partner, Leslie Baxter, and I were driving across country when she moved from the University of California, Davis to the University of Iowa. And we, in the early 90s, and we talked about doing a study, and she looked at me and said she wanted to do a study of step-family communication. And we didn't know each other that well then, and I was totally amazed because I'm a stepchild, an adult stepchild. And we immediately launched into doing that work. And probably, I never counted, but I've probably done some 20 to 25 studies of step families, sometimes with Leslie and sometimes without. And it just launched me into family communication at the time when family communication was starting to rise at the National Association. Family communication classes were starting to be taught probably around the late 80s and sometimes later. And so I've been studying step families ever since, and also started studying what are called fictive, but I don't really like that term because it makes them sound not real, but what we call voluntary kin. And those are those people, one of those understudied family forms, those are people that feel like family even though they're not related to you by blood or law. And you probably could think that there's some real commonalities between the studies of step families and the study of fictive families. And in my own case, because the step family was very difficult, especially in the early years, having those voluntary family members, other places I could be and invest myself, helped me to also cope with becoming a step family. So really started getting into family communication just as it started to grow. It's been a really good place for me in my scholarship and me as a person.
So I'm kind of curious now, where did people submit their work before there was an interpersonal division or a family division? I imagine family, they would submit it to interpersonal, but.
They probably submitted it to the interpersonal division, sometimes to the health comm division, which also got started in the late 80s. Sometimes if they were more diverse families, people submitted to intercultural communication. But it was really tricky because almost all the research, especially in interpersonal communication, was quantitative, using mostly surveys, sometimes experimental studies. I'm also one of the early qualitative scholars, and it was I couldn't submit my work to the interpersonal communication division because it was qualitative. It just wouldn't have been accepted. So sometimes I submitted disability work to health communication, or to argue that it was communicative culture and submitted to intercultural. And that's what was so great when the communication division really got going. A lot of people who founded it were much more open to qualitative work. And later, I can talk a little bit later too, but to critical work. And so family communication became a really important home in the discipline for those of us who are qualitative scholars, who are really challenged and had to fight really hard to have our work accepted.
Yeah, and I think both you and Leslie get a lot of credit, much deserved credit, for bringing qualitative methods in as well. So I want to go back to that story for a second. I love that story about you and helping her to move cross country. A lot of people are always curious, how do these research collaborations kind of start, or how do they come about? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Leslie and I had seen her. Leslie was mostly a quantitative scholar, but she had a qualitative background. She was a huge scholar. She was already a big name. And I had seen her present at since I started out. And we were at the International Association for Relationships conference, I think around 1990 or so. And we had met. We met through governance too. We met through at the Legislative Assembly of the Western States Communication Association as delegates. So sometimes getting yourself involved, for those of you who are grad students, especially in the discipline, that's how you meet people. And so at this personal relationships conference, we decided to go have coffee or breakfast or something. And we started talking, and I started talking about my interest in rituals. And at the time, there were couples who were renewing their marital vows, sometimes in church, sometimes in a park, sometimes, it was new, it was in the media, and I'd even seen articles about it. I remember there was an article in the TV Guide, and Leslie hadn't seen any of this because she was such a big scholar. She was working all the time. And so we started talking about this idea of renewing marital vows. And at that moment, we launched a study. And we said, we should study this. And this was also, again, kind of a bridge of an interpersonal and family communication study. How do people do this? And so I and some of my students went out to a lot of these rituals, and we started, not everybody had a video camera, so we would videotape these rituals for people and give them a copy of the video as a gift. And that was one of the ways that I got started. And started working with her, and we just formed this research collaboration that went on till Leslie retired about 3 years ago. And we're still really good friends. We talk constantly, but it was just the most wonderful, fruitful research partnership for us personally, but also I think it allowed us to add to the field of family communication.
Yeah, I always love hearing those stories about how partnerships came into being. And speaking of
Yeah.
partnerships, you and Kathleen Galvin wrote a brilliant review article that examines some of our essential theories and topics in the area of family communication studies. And I know that was only about 5 years ago that you all wrote that, but I'm wondering, do you think a lot has changed in the field in that 5 years? Or you can give us a little recap of the article too, but I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. That article was, in the Journal of Family Theory and Review, which is a journal published by the National Council on Family Relations, NCFR. And this is an association that's the biggest, most important family association, interdisciplinary association, at least in the United States, although it has an international touch. And they often don't know about our research, and they don't know who we are. So it was really wonderful that Kathleen was invited to write that review article, and I joined her. And since that time, Elizabeth, there is a National Council on Family Relations source book that's hopefully in press, and they've never had a family communication chapter either.
Oh, wow.
And Elizabeth Suter and I had applied to write that chapter, where we've written, really it's a follow-up to the article that Galvin and I wrote. There's a lot of similarities. I mean, one of the things we say, it's interesting, in both of those sources, they asked us to write about family communication as a theory. But Jimmie, you and I know it's not a theory, it's a field of study made up of multiple theories. And I have Leslie and I, Corey Floyd and Elizabeth Suter and I have a family theories reader, which I think there's 28 different theories. So we've had to write a chapter that says, excuse us, this is not a theory, it's a whole field, and here's what it is, and try to squish everything into one 25-page chapter. I got to tell you, it's a real challenge. What Kathleen and I referred to a little bit in that article that you're recommending, and what Elizabeth and I have talked about even more, is looking at, all that quantitative, that post-positivist work in family, the large body of qualitative scholarship in family, but also talking about the need for critical scholarship in family. And in fact, Leslie Baxter and I made that argument first back in our 2006 book, and it was really radical at the time. Mm-hmm. And we put on a convention panel, and there were people standing up and yelling, oh, there shouldn't be critical work in family. And we said, well, gee, why not? And just push that agenda, both in interpersonal and family communication, and your work fits into that too. And as you know, you have a chapter coming in our new interpersonal theories book. So I think that's the biggest difference, is we've seen such a proliferation, and we track in both the interpersonal and the family theories book, we track all the studies that have been done in that year period. So we started in 1990, we've now got it all the way up going to 2019. And we were able to see, that when most of the work started out is quantitative, which is very good research, and now there's so much more qualitative work and a healthy presence of critical work as well, so that we can't ignore families that are understudied. We can't ignore what are called discourse dependent. I mean, all families are discourse dependent. Yeah. We all need communication to form and enact. And Kathleen Galvin coined that term. But what she really wanted to refer to, and maybe we would just say, some families are more discourse dependent than others. So for example, in our research, when you're a step family, there's no set of rules. There's no set of guidelines that really tell you how to take this group of strangers together and try to make a family. You have to figure it out. And you have to figure it out within a system that sometimes doesn't value that family form, or where there may be resistance, or for a LGBTQ family. There can be a lot of cultural resistance to that family. So are you bringing together a family when there aren't a lot of rules and models, but you're doing so within a larger cultural system that may not accept you well. So That's what all this research is about.
Yeah, I just actually taught discourse dependence yesterday in my online family communication seminar. And the
Hmm.
students really got into it, and they're like, "Is any
Yeah,
family not discourse dependent now?" So
really. And
I
I
said,
think
make the
you're
argument. Yeah, go ahead.
and all families are all fam. That's why we study communication, Jimmy, and you know this better than anybody. Communication is the central thing. It's not even a thing. It's the central process that makes us human. It's the central, everything that you and I are. We've been friends and colleagues in the discipline for a long time. All of that forms from communication. There's
Yes.
no rules for it. There's no expectations for it. And every once in a while we've had to navigate a couple difficulties. Nothing huge, but everybody does, right? That's all communication. So all families are discourse dependent. But when you are living in a family that's less traditional, you're even more, I would just say you're even more discourse
Right.
dependent.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think
I'm
we have
glad
some
you're starting
theorizing
to
to do
recognize
there.
that.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to bring up, I go to a lot of interdisciplinary conferences, not only in family, but in sex studies or those kinds of things. It is
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me how people a lot of times want like one measure. So maybe not necessarily a theory, but they like want a family comm measure. And they're like, no one
Yeah.
in your field has a simple measure. It's like, well, there are some that float out there, but they don't stick around
Yeah.
long. So
Yeah.
I think that is something that a lot of people don't realize is that it is so complex and multifaceted. And to
Yeah.
that point, I know that you've kind of seen that complexity and that multifaceted nature of family communication grow. You're really well known for your knowledge of the history, not only of the
Mm-hmm.
discipline writ large, but of family communication and interpersonal studies. And so, given that rich history that you have, I want to take a moment to tap into that. And so I'll start broad. What should we know about the history of family communication?
Well, can I start a little broader with the history of the discipline?
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I won't go for very long because I could
You
talk for
go as long
hours.
as you want. Like I think this is stuff
This,
people need to hear.
yeah, was in grad school, we didn't even, in undergrad school, we didn't study this very much for some reason. And it really wasn't until I was walking into the NCA presidency and I thought, geez, I better sit down and really study the history even more than I have. So you could just quickly trace the history of our disciplines really old. You could say we're one of the oldest academic disciplines, going back to Aristotle and the Greeks, but really going back to Africa and China. And when people started studying communication systematically, often people studied rhetoric and they were studying public speaking. And so up until the 20th century, there wasn't a field of communication studies, but most people were studying public speaking. They were teaching public speaking. They were in English departments, sometimes in theater departments, sometimes even in audiology, speech pathology areas, sometimes in those programs, but most often in English.
Mm-hmm.
Around the teens, the late teens, the speech people started going to the English conferences and saying, gosh, there's something different about speech that isn't just true about writing, about essays. And we would like at this conference to have our own convention panels. And the English people sort of poo-pooed that and said there isn't anything, that the speech is just an essay on its feet. And these speech people said, I don't think so. By 1917, they walked out and they formed and this was in Chicago, right down where our meeting used to be too. They formed their own association. And the 17 people formed an association around teaching public speaking. And our national, which became our national association, they developed the first journal. And they had to think really carefully about, well, now we have an association, what the heck do we do now? And they really disagreed. Are we an association about teaching? Are we an association about research? It was hard to be an association about research because there were very few people had PhDs at that time, but a few people did, and they realized that they argued that research would give us credibility, that if we were really going to be a serious discipline like sociology and English and all the other associations, we had to do research. And most of those people who were trained in social psychology and sociology, and so their work became more quantitative. So
Mm-hmm.
we have this split in our field between people who thought we should just be about teaching and teaching speech, people who were more interested in studying humanistic perspective, like studying great speeches, And then people who started studying, doing, of taking a science or a social science approach. And sometimes those people didn't get along so well, even up until when I came into discipline.
Yeah.
Now that's all important because family, notice I haven't said family communication. It didn't really exist. And it was after World War II that during and after World War II, when you think about the atrocities, for example, of Nazi Germany, and you need to study persuasion. How are people persuaded to do, normal people, to do terrible things? And so there were people that were studying persuasion. There were people that were studying media. And so the field of communication started taking off. There were people that were studying small group communication and democracy. So in the 40s and the 50s. And sometime in the late 50s or into the 60s, people started studying interpersonal communication. This was really important because in America in the 60s, there was a lot of stress and strife. There was protest against the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was growing. Everything we see happening right now sort of springs out of that time. The women's movement. There were all of these movements about equality and power and relationships, and that we have to get along. And so when I started, so people started studying, and then finally in the early 70s teaching interpersonal communication classes. And that's kind of when I came into college, was in the 70s. And it was kind of exciting because this topic of interpersonal communication was just, for everybody who was trying to find themselves like I was at that age, it was really relevant. So that's where interpersonal came in. And like I said before, it was largely quantitative research, and it was largely very psychology and psychology oriented. And then into the 80s, people started branching out to study health, to study families, to study intercultural communication, etc. And then it all took off from there. So you would not have seen a family communication course until at least the mid 80s, but probably a little bit later. And Kathleen Galvin's first family communication book that I'm now a co-author on, the first edition was in 1982. So lots of stuff was happening, and you can sort of see where it came from. I hope that's a really fast look,
No.
but it's important to understand that history because you understand how our teaching and our research tie.
Yeah. So now where do you think it's going? You talked a little bit about the critical stuff. Where else do you think we have to grow or where we might go?
Our research is still, when you're a researcher like me and like you, and you're doing research where you're interviewing people or you're giving people surveys, you got to find people, right? And so it's been easiest for us, I think, to study college students who are by and large white. We know a lot about college students from the ages of 18 to 22 because they're sitting in classes. And there's nothing wrong, by the way, with college students between 18 and 22. But we're seeing people now, I think, do a couple of things. One, I think we're seeing research branch out and saying that we have to study what are less evotypical or non-traditional family types. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing people really make an effort. And that's hard to do for me, for example, in step families. It's still hard for me to get non-white populations and to find people who would want to participate. We're seeing people just taking a more critical lens to family communication research. And I think one of the more exciting things is that we're seeing people who are doing research that has an explicitly translational piece to it.
Yeah.
And so that they are doing research, and all of us, I think, in family communication have done a decent job in trying to take our work out to the media, for example, and to talk about our work as broadly as possible. I have volunteered on my campus to work with a group that's doing divorce mediation, and I'm hoping that they can incorporate me into their work. But I think that translational piece, when I started as a graduate student, you know what the term basic research is, right? You do research to learn, research for research's sake. And that's not a bad thing. But if you did work that was more applied, you were seen as weaker. And not as, you're not a super scientist. And today, I think we see a much more natural partnership between family communication and wanting to get that work out there and designing research that even has intervention steps in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's exciting.
I think that raises good ethical questions too, and makes us think about why we do what we do. And I think, quite frankly, we're in the midst of budget cuts nationwide now. We're going to have to start singing for our supper a little more and not taking the we can only do basic research approach. All right. So,
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
it's always been hard for me to, it's just always been hard for me to think about if I never wanted to do research that I couldn't bring to other people, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's again on my campus. I've spoken, for various groups on the campus and volunteered when people want me in the community, as much as we have time to, and just to speak in the media. So I'm part of the national, I lost the name of my own association. I'm part of an association who's founded by Stephanie Kuntz, Council on Contemporary Families. Sorry, Stephanie. The Council on Contemporary Families, which is a group that is dedicated to making sure that the people who speak in the media about family are scholars and practitioners, and rather than people that don't have a good background. So that's our whole purpose.
Her training, if anyone watching this ever has the opportunity to go to her training seminar, it's wonderful.
She
teaches you,
great.
Here's how you get your message across. Don't get lost in the nitty gritty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was $30, and I was like, this is the best $30 that I've ever spent.
Yeah. I'm on her speed dial, so whenever she needs communication people, she'll call me. But she's an incredible woman.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I think is cool is that, and I think so this first season of Family Conversations, I'll be talking with people that are members of NCA. But as Family Com has grown in ICA, I think it's really been interesting how you will see people that, like, I think it's very interpersonal in the United States. It's like we're kind of an interpersonal com, but there were a lot of media scholars who showed up to the family communication pre-conferences and said, oh no, I'm a family communication scholar. Or people dealing with policy and law and what we might call rhetoric over here, they were more discourse oriented. I think that's another cool turn.
That's really exciting.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
And we're in NCA, and we are the National Communication Association, and it's not that we don't welcome people from other countries. We do, right. But that's really been kind of let that be the bailiwick a little bit more of ICA, International Communication Association, or the International Association on Relationship Research, where there are people from multidisciplines and also from all over the world, and we have to expand our research.
Yeah, Walida Fifi and colleagues they have this new chapter out, and it looks at the samples that we use, and they're looking more at interpersonal communication research. But one of the arguments that is made is that even if we are a national communication association or working within the U.S., it doesn't mean we should be limited in how we think about our theories and embracing international samples or audiences or that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, not at all.
Which again, if you're doing,
we just don't all have.
It's harder to do. Yeah.
And it's just But they're right.
that could be a whole nother episode.
And even to find that could be a whole other episode. Yeah. But to find non-white samples is challenging. And I'm living in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it's not something we shouldn't try. And I have to say, it's not something we haven't tried, but we haven't done well enough.
All right. So moving on to our final question, I'm planning on asking everyone, what is something good or something that you think would be wonderful for people to read related to family communication studies? It doesn't have to necessarily be a piece of scholarship, although it certainly can be and probably for most people will be. But I just want to know, what's something that we can read that will enhance our knowledge of family communication? And it could be a classic, it could be something new, book, article, whatever you want to share. What do you think that family communication scholars should consume, so to speak?
You're asking a person who just is finishing 9 years as a department chair this week. I feel like I haven't read a thing for. I have. I do think. I mean, not to hark my own work. I think that this article that Suter and I are writing for the source book on family communication. Anybody can write me. I'd be glad to share that. I think gives a very good overview. I think Kathleen Galvin's chapter in 2006 that she wrote on discourse dependent family centers our ways. There's one other piece. It's kind of an interesting piece that Leslie Baxter wrote in 2004 that was published in the journal Personal Relationships. So it was for another interdisciplinary journal. And she really makes, I know it's an article you and I like, because she makes an argument about communication constituting relationships and selves. And to me, that's, and I talk about this on all these different readings I've just suggested too. We can think about communications transmitting a message, go to bed at 8 o'clock or you're in trouble. You can think about it, even thinking about a series of effects. If I communicate this way, I can predict that certain things will happen. But I think the deeper power of our discipline of family communication is understanding just what I said at the beginning, that family is that communications is that central process that constitutes ourselves, who we are, and who we are in family and personal relationships. And that article by Baxter, even just the first 7 pages of Leslie Baxter's 2004 essay in personal relationships, can really light your hair on fire when you think about how important and central and powerful communication is in all relationships, but especially in families.
It's one of those pieces that when you teach it, if you're teaching a family comm grad seminar, people just light up and then they're like, oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. Like it kind of, it's something that's always been there and that deep down we know is true. But then when you read it, and then, you know, of course, the way she lays it out is so brilliant. I love that article.
Yes, the best line in there, she said, if you think about, everybody talks about communication in our relationship. She said, but we really need to think about our relationships in communication. And you know, you have to read that 3 or 4 times and think hard about what it means. But it makes us, and it's what I argue in the piece that you recommended in the new, and these other chapters that I'm recommending, is this is what the field of family communication can offer in a unique way to the broader study and understanding of families.
Yeah, and Bob Craig has been pretty adamant. This is a very unique thing to communication studies because it's not quite social construction. It's the constitutive nature, which I love that. So so obviously I'm a fan of that work as well.
Yeah, we share that.
The thing that I've quoted the most comes from either that article or the similar one that was also released in 2004. But it's not always about the communication in a relationship, but the relationship in the communication, which
I think that's I think you're talking about Leslie's 2004.
It's in one.
Maybe it could be other places too, but it's just it's so.
That could be a whole nother episode as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Now we've talked a lot about other people's research. We talked a little bit about the research or the work you've done, kind of collecting the field. I want to end this on one more note actually, and give you a bonus question. And that is, I know that I remember the first time I ever saw you talk, you referred to yourself as a data hound. And I was like, oh, I think I am too. Maybe I'm a data hound. And then, you know, you talked about how you love to collect data. And so given that you've done all these studies, what out of all you've done in your career, what has been your favorite study, or a study that really stands out for you as one that really captures what you see as yourself as a scholar and as a family communication person?
I think it's the study that we published in 2008, I think. We did a study of, we brought focus groups of young adults, young adult stepchildren, mostly young adult stepchildren together. And we had them talk about what it was like to become a step family and how their parent, and they're divorced usually, parents communicated. We call this parent teams, and how these people functioned. And, you know, it was hard. I mean, they got to share often some really good stories, but often really difficult stories. And we videotaped these focus groups. And during these focus groups, we didn't really plan for this. And we gave them a task, and we said, could you pretend you're writing a brochure giving advice to parents and step parents and, you know, co-parents. And this one guy looked at us and said, can we draw? And we said, yeah, I guess so. And so he took out a piece of paper and he drew this little boy. It was I'm looking at myself here at a triangle on Zoom. It was a little boy, and all you could see was his face in the middle, and his arms and his legs were stretched to the corner of the paper, each being pulled by adult hands. And all he saw was big eyes and no mouth. And that was amazing. And then they wrote some things about what communication was about. And I was just listening to these focus groups about, you know, being a data person. We went and we sat in a booth while they were, you know, we videotaped these, and we interviewed them. But when they did the brochure, we went away and sat in the booth, and I was just listening and going, what are they saying? What are they talking about? And then another group drew a picture, and after that, we gave them pictures and glitter pens, and you said, do whatever you want. And almost all of them started drawing, which was fantastic. And we put these drawings in our article. The other drawing was a little girl with these little pigtails, and she was in the middle of a mommy and a daddy and a mommy and a daddy, I guess. I mean, they looked like, it was a pretty heterosexual picture, but it looked like two pairs of parents and step parents. And instead of being pulled, she was happy and they were holding her hand. And between the hands were hearts. And the students that we interviewed, the participants said that those hearts represented communication. There were two very different views of communication. One, that somebody, and I was listening and listening, and I was sitting in the booth kind of putting my head down going, what are they trying to tell me? What do kids want? And I realized we realized that kids often got caught in the middle. That's the first picture, right? The little boy being stretched.
Yeah.
But the other picture was centered. And that I said, they don't want to be caught in the middle. They want to be centered. They want to be in the center of these parents' attention where they think they belong, and so do I. And that was a very powerful moment as a scholar, as I was just sitting there listening, and then as we went back. And so this article is called Centered, Not Caught in the Middle. And we have those two pictures in the article. So that's the fun part about collecting data and not writing for me a questionnaire, letting them react to what I think's going on. But they told me not, and they told me in the way they wanted to tell me, not only just with their words, but also they wanted to draw and they wanted to show it to us. And isn't that neat? And that's why that's probably my favorite study ever. Yeah, even though I think the theory kind of moved on from there. And if you ever get a chance to read it, I think it's a really powerful one.
Students love that one too. Yeah. And I like it because I think it's just real easy to go to the interview and just do a simple interview. And so I try to be creative and say, this could be a really nice life if you want to be a researcher and go in and have moments like this that are not only, meaningful in and of themselves, but that contribute to a body of knowledge and things that we can do.
Yeah. It was really transformative for me as a scholar. I think I still talk about, so when I go out and talk about step families to different groups, these pictures I show, and I can talk about what we learned, what we heard that day. And when I show those pictures to people, whether they're students in my class or were people off the campus, they see things in those pictures that I had never seen. For example, I never noticed really for 5 years that little boy has two eyes, big eyes.
Sorry, and I lost that last part, John, with the lag and the
little boy on the picture that's being pulled. He has two eyes, big eyes. He has no mouth. The guy didn't draw a mouth.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
and so he couldn't talk. Now that's a little psychological, right? But it was actually a young undergraduate student who noticed that. And I said, wow, I noticed the hands, I noticed the eyes. I just never noticed they didn't even have a mouth. Well, so we can learn from those things.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. We can learn from those things as we take them out.
Well, and that's a testament to the way we can bring research into the classroom and help students see what we do and why it's important. I think that's just important for the academy in general. We need people to understand why professors contribute to the world. But that is like we mentioned earlier, another episode. All right, so we're out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is
you're more than welcome.
I truly believe that we've got to capture our discipline's history and understand where we come from. So this is a great way to start this series.
Great.
But at the same time, I love hearing about your work too, because you really have been an instrumental part of family communication growing and thriving. And I only hope I get to work with the Nebraska grads someday.
I know. We'd love that.
I
hope we're all be hiring soon.
Well, yeah.
We've got some fabulous people coming out on the
All right.
Thank you, Jimmie, for asking
That's it. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Family Conversations. Check out in the link section, you'll find links to all the resources we've mentioned here, as well as links to future episodes of the show. And I'll see you next time. Take good care.
Bye.